See, I'm a psychologist, and I do my little experiment to see how long I stand here till you're quiet. It's kind of like being a mom, right? You know, how long do I have to stare at you before you stop crying? But no, I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming so early in the morning to hear a fantastic presentation. First, I want to acknowledge our change makers, and particularly John Kane and his wife Jan, who are our change maker members, Dan Stokels. And just so you know, the change makers is our premier support group for the School of Social Ecology. They help us immensely to fund scholarships and fellowships and different opportunities for our students. So we strongly encourage you to be part of making change, and we strive to use science to drive solutions to a lot of important problems and confront issues that are pertinent and relevant to our society and to our own lives. So please join us with Changemakers as much as you can. We appreciate your support. The Daybreak Dialogues are a fantastic new program, and I want to give credit to our Senior Development Director, Doug Colby, and his staff and communications staff for developing this program. I actually had nothing to do with it. And we are always looking for ways to share with the community and share with our alums and friends the important work and really the amazing work that our faculty do. I'm astounded often at just the incredible faculty we have and the work that they do and its relevance to our daily lives. So today I have the great pleasure to introduce Professor Candace Odgers. She's a professor of psychology and social behavior in our department. I have to read this because she has so many titles I can't possibly memorize them, and certainly not this early in the morning. She's a fellow of the Jacobs Foundation, and I know how to pronounce that correctly, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and she actually rejoined our faculty, and I always have to tell my story that when I became dean, and she was at Duke University at the Sanford School of Public Policy, I just sent her an email and I said, "Are you ready to come home?" And she was, and we got her back. Her research focuses on how social inequalities and adversity influence children's health and well-being, and particularly relevant is looking at how new technologies, mobile phones, web-based tools can be used to understand and hopefully improve young people's lives, because as we all know, we were just chatting about our 3-year-old grandchildren who are like, "I want my iPad," you know, and "Grandma, don't you know how to do this? Go into settings and hit this." You know, I'm like, "You're 3." Her work really has far-reaching implications for our technological society, and you came here to hear her and not me, so with that, I'm pleased to welcome Candace.
Thanks. Well, welcome, good morning. You know, when we first started planning this event, I didn't quite realize that this topic would be kind of at the center of the news media. And so I've reframed a little bit, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the current controversies that are happening right now, as well as a lot of our ongoing work and the work of other people here at UCI. And so, you know, everyone has been talking about kids on their phone, right? And it's become a little bit cliche to say, every kid has a phone, the kids are constantly on their phones, but indeed that's, you know, what you see if you look at any longitudinal data. We have a graph here that shows you just over time kind of what's happened with kids' smartphone ownership. And we first started going into the field in about 2009, and about that time we had this graph. Ownership, about 50% of the kids, of teenagers, had a phone or had access to a phone. Now it's around 90%. This data are from 2015, so it's probably full saturation by now. So most teenagers have a smartphone. The average age they get them is 10. So when my child was 5, he actually asked for one. And when I asked him why he wanted a phone, it was because he wanted to get text messages, but he couldn't read. But he knew that these were very salient things. These were important things, and he saw me smile when I got mine, and he wanted to be involved, right? So We're still waiting. And kids, they're constantly connected, and we're constantly connected as well. And so if you look at how frequently kids are on their phone, this is a recent survey, 2015, 1 in 4 teens are online almost constantly, right? And the rest of them are several times a day, right? So there's a lot of connectivity, a lot of time. Common Sense Media, for the parents in the room, if you want one resource from today, I would say Common Sense Media. They do a lot of screening of content online, really wonderful group of people in terms of generating data and generating information that's usable by parents. And they did the census in 2015, and the hours online are pretty stunning, right? In terms of hours in the day, and kids have to do other things like eat and sleep and go to school, hopefully. But what they came down when they surveyed all the kinds of things that kids are doing online. So these are tweens, the 6 hours, right? So these are kids about 8 to 12. They're on for media time about 6 hours, and about 4.3 hours of that is actual screen time. The other time, kids are actually still reading. They still read. They like to read. They spend time with books. So they're not completely on their screens, but 6 hours of media time and 4.36 hours of screen time. When we get to the older kids, we're at 9 hours, right, of kind of media time, books, movies, videos, and 6.5 hours of that is on a screen, right? So they're spending a lot of time on screens. If we divide this up and we think about kids who are living in low-income households, they're actually spending much more time on screens. And so it works out to be about 3 hours more a day on average. Okay. These are data from our own study. We've followed about 2,000 kids in North Carolina that are population representative. And you see a couple things on this graph. The first thing is that very high line at the top. This is very fancy. Okay. And this is just having regular internet access at home and school. And this is something that we've been worried about in terms of a digital divide, so making sure that everybody has access, right, to do their homework, to be online, to be connected. And so we see, about 95% of our kids across that line. There are some disparities there still in terms of who has access. But what you see across age, and you can think of this dotted line here, smartphone ownership, right, starting at the 11-year-olds and going up to the 16-year-olds. So when we get up to our 15-year-olds, 85% of those kids have a smartphone in our most recent survey. And it begins early, right? So when we're down at the 11 and 10-year-olds, we're into that about 44% range. All right, so the question that's come up, and it's come up a lot recently, is this constant connection, is it harmful for our kids, right, across a lot of domains? And I'm going to focus mostly on mental health. What it might be doing to their mental health symptoms of depression, anxiety, etc. And part of the reason is that I'm not a media, I didn't get into this to study media. I'm not a media researcher. I'm a developmental psychologist who's been studying kids' mental health for a long time. And when I first came to UCI, we were looking for ways to get better measures of kids' symptoms, so their depression, their anxiety, what was happening in their lives and daily life. And we were kind of frustrated with the common approach of going into a classroom at the time. Now it's done on a tablet, but paper and pen, going into a classroom, getting kids to fill out a survey of, in the past year, has any of these things happened to you? Have you experienced these things? Have you been depressed? We thought, there's a fair amount of kids online. Maybe we could follow them on their phones, or our phones, give them phones. And so that's what we did, and we got daily measures of mental health. And while we were in the field, we were also trying to understand how different experiences, so exposure to violence, different things in the home was influencing them. And we also asked about digital screen time. So now we have daily measures of what kids are doing on their screen and daily measures of their mental health. And at that time, when we started collecting those data, we didn't realize how relevant this was going to be to the current discussion around screen time and kids' mental health. All right. So I want to introduce Madeline George, who is here today. She's at UT Dallas right now, but she's a UCI alum. And Maddie was there in the early days. And one of the things that we kept hearing from parents as they brought their kids in were questions about smartphone usage, probably the same questions that many of you have today, right? So what are the types of limits I should be putting on? How can I best monitor content? How can I make sure my kid's keeping up in the digital age? How can I keep my kids safe, right? How can I keep their information safe? And so we started scouring the literature to try and get resources for parents. At the same time, we were looking at the media and we were seeing things pop up, right? So Cell phones are causing kids to become digital zombies, right? So the headlines were everywhere. And we were trying to evaluate, these are the fears. These are the most common fears that we're seeing. What's the science behind those fears, right? And what can we tell the parents that are coming into our lab? And so we spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of years researching this and surveying the literature, and we distilled it down to these 7 fears. So this ties back to the theme of the talk, and these were the things that were coming up in parent surveys. Some of them you might identify with. Safety, who are they talking to? Are they at risk for being solicited online? Cyberbullying, are there new victims, right? What harm is this causing? Do our kids have no social skills? So there's a book called Alone Together, right? Where we all have this image of kids sitting with their phones, right, in a circle, texting each other or texting someone else, right? So does that mean they have no social skills, or they just have more friends that are in the circle? Being someone else online, there was some concern about kids were going online and taking on a whole new identity. Is this causing conflict with parents, a divide with parents? Is it impairing their cognitive performance? We know that we're really bad at multitasking. This seems like multitasking, right? So what is the evidence there? And then is it causing them to lose their sleep? So we went through and we surveyed the literature, and we tried to take stock of kind of what does the science say? Does it support our fears? And I'll talk a little about this throughout the talk, but given the recent fear paradigm shift to mental health, what I want to talk about is the reaction first to this work. It came out, and one of the things we surveyed, we were surprised, right? We were surprised that we were finding more positive associations, right? Kids who are online more and more connected. I'm looking at Stephanie Reich, who's here, who's done a lot of this work, also have stronger friendships online. There was longitudinal work showing us that kids who had good relationships with their parents early on, right, had bigger social online networks and then had better relationships as adolescents, for example. We were seeing some really positive things about kids' relationships in the data, so associations, not necessarily causal. We were finding some risk, right? So we were finding that there weren't necessarily new victims of cyberbullying, that kids who were victimized online, we could see that offline. And the good news there was many of our interventions for cyberbullying were working in both contexts, right? So it wasn't an entirely new thing. There were new tools, and there were maybe stronger effects. But the survey of the research was showing us something very clearly, that offline risk was very correlated with online risk, right? And that meant for us as researchers, for clinicians, as for parents, we could see it, right? We could see it in the same ways that we could see it before. We could see a lot of the predictors of what kids were going to experience negative problems online, and what kids might be most at risk. And a couple of news stories were run on this at the time, showing that, and nothing really inflammatory, I thought, which was that maybe there were some benefits for kids being online. Maybe this wasn't an all bad news story. And I had in the past, researched some controversial things, and hadn't really gotten that much pushback. But my inbox and my message board was full, and people were screaming. And they were scared, and so I don't want to make too much light of it, but people were very angry about this, and everyone had a story of a kid. And that's important, that they had a story of a kid, but I had to stop for a second and figure out where this was coming from, because our survey of the research was saying that this isn't as bad as it might seem. This should potentially be good news to parents, but people were scared, and people were calling me. One dad in particular, I picked up my phone in North Carolina, and he just started screaming at me. And he said, before my kids got their phones, before they became teenagers, they were involved with this family. They were at home at the dinner table. They were engaged in conversation. They were at church, and now they're on their phones. And part of me thought, you have adolescents, right? Welcome to adolescence, right? But this was a real concern, right? And so part of what you'll hear throughout the talk is that many of the things that we're seeing with kids being drawn to the phone, we're looking at a kid on a phone, but we should be asking, why is the kid drawn to the phone, right? They're drawn to their friends. They're drawn for the connection. They're drawn for some of the rewards. So there's some good things that are on the attractor side. Now, there are some bad things, and we'll talk about that too. But part of this discussion, I hope, is a more balanced perspective on kind of what the science says, kind of what we know, and what we can do to support kids in a digital age, because we're not going back. We're going forward. Okay. So one of the things that was interesting when Maddie was reviewing this research, and this is from one of my colleagues, Yalda Yules, that fears about new technologies and new things, how kids are spending their time, it's not new, right? So this is the introduction of 5-cent novels, right? And this caused a lot of panic, right? And so here's a quote from this paper. And you can see some parallels, right? It's doubted by authority whether a public library confers any benefit by providing boys who ought to be playing outdoors, right, with such pablum. And you can read on. Their parents, it is presumed, neither know nor care what they are doing, right? And so you could see themes, right? You could see themes with the introduction of comic books. You can see this with the introduction of TV, with radio, with music. And so as adults, we often don't like what kids do, right? But the question is it harmful, right? So the reason this is so interesting now is these fears have always been there, but in the last 6 months, I think they've hit a fevered pace. And so this is an article in The Atlantic. If you haven't read it, you might be one of the few who has not yet. This has gone kind of everywhere. It's a woman who wrote a book about changing trends and how kids are basically spending their time and that they're growing up a little bit slower, right? And the header of this, and sometimes there's clickbait where kind of the article doesn't really match, but this really is an argument how smartphones might have destroyed an entire generation of children, right? And so this conversation, has escalated, and a couple weeks ago, many of you might have seen this, Apple investors and the teachers union have published an open letter, right, with a couple of psychologists demanding that they end child smartphone addiction, right, and that they act now to take a number of measures to protect children. Now, I'm not saying that Apple should not be responsible and step up to do this. Technology companies have a role, and we should talk about this. But this was a pretty dramatic claim, and the demands were based on some of the evidence that I'm going to talk about right now. So are the kids okay, right? So first of all, let's just take stock. This generation constantly on their phone, how are they doing, right? And if they're not okay, is it because of their phone? All right, so there's good news. There's really good news, right? So we've hit record numbers of students graduating high school, record numbers of children, young people attending college, right? So you can see these trends over time from 1970 to 2017 here. The top is high school graduation, we're up to 85%. And the bottom is college, right, a bachelor degree, right? And so for people who study adolescence and adolescent mental health, getting an education is a wonderful thing. These are important indicators. We are very happy with our kids right now. Less teen pregnancies. This is a very kind of costly outcome, right? This is something in public health we care about a lot, and it's at the lowest rate that we've seen, right? So this is data in the United States. They've fallen dramatically over time. We see the same thing. The graph quality is poor here, but binge drinking. Monitoring the Future monitors drug use, and we're seeing this across a number of countries. We're seeing declines in drug use, maybe uptick in cannabis in California. We'll see what happens with that. But, kids are graduating high school. They're having less sex. We know from surveys they're getting, there are less teen births. There's less substance use, right? But wait, Tuesday of this week, there was kind of some breaking news on this, right? And what the claim in the Atlantic article was, we're on the brink of a mental health crisis with this entire generation of kids, right? And then we need to pay attention. And that's why adults have been paying attention to this. We're worried about our mental health. And so this is data. It's got thousands and thousands, actually, tens of thousands of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, right? And what you're seeing here is across time, we get to about 2007 here, and then there's this dramatic drop. And this drop, charts like this, have been recently on CNN, Scientific America, every news outlet you see this, they're calling it a cliff that children are falling off in terms of loneliness, in terms of self-esteem, in terms of mental health. And this looks scary, right? So what is happening, right? What is happening with our kids in terms of their mental health outcome when all these other indicators look okay? So I want you to introduce you to Amy. So Amy's also working with these same data. So the great thing about these data is that they're publicly available online. So people can use them and access them and track these same things. And she saw these data and immediately started to look, because she had the same data set. And what she sees when she plots it, so here is that initial attempt, if you don't truncate the data, it looks like that. Okay, that still looks something might be happening in 2007, Oh wait, but here's the real scale. This is the scale, the y-axis, right? And that's the effect, right? That's the effect that is the cliff. So it's a scale from 0 to 5, right? So I teach statistics, and this is, someone just gave me the best example. I couldn't make this up. This is a tiny, tiny shift. We can detect it because tens of thousands of kids have been measured on these measures. But if I'm watching this, I'm not on CNN. I'm not on CNN saying that our kids are in real trouble, right? And so this is the part that isn't being communicated to the public, that's the effect that we're seeing, right, in terms of this generation of kids. So this is self-esteem as one example, right? Okay, but what about kids and our mental health? That doesn't necessarily mean that mobile phones aren't worrisome or that mental health or any mental health problems. That means that there's some sort of communication problem right now in terms of how we're talking to the media and the conversation that we're having about kids' mental health. So most good research supports what's called a Goldilocks hypothesis, right? And you can guess where we're going here. That if you are a kid that isn't online, that isn't connected, your mental health looks a little bit different. If you're a kid who's in the middle range, and they've kind of went through and tried to quantify that, and I can tell you that your mental health actually looks a little bit better than average. There's no noticeable association between kind of time online or activities and your mental health. Once you get out to the extremes, everybody sees, kids who are online about 6 to 7 hours a day, there's some problems there, right? So they're not looking as good on depression. They obviously, they don't have as many friends. They're feeling a little bit more lonely. So that's where we're seeing some of these negative associations at the tail ends of the distribution, right? And so this is some work by a colleague in the UK. He had 120,000 British adolescents, so again, a really big sample. And again, he shows this classic kind of Goldilocks effect, right? Where kids, this is mental health, so lower scores are worse. Kind of kids who are online, not at all, look a little bit worse. Then we get, kids who look the best are 1 or 2 hours. Now you're thinking to yourself, what are those kids doing? Right? They have busy lives, right? They're doing other things. They're scheduled. Their parents might have them in a kind of schedule that doesn't provide it all that time online. And that's indeed what we see in terms of different family structures. And then when you get out here, you get some sort of decline. Now, this is a great study, and he's went to the media a lot and talked about it, and he's talked about it in the following way, which I think has been really helpful. He says, there's no association between moderate levels of screen time and mental health, right? There's negative correlations at the high levels, like out at the extremes, but let's be clear, it explains less than 1% of the variation, right? And what that means is all the differences between kids and mental health, 99.64% of that is explained by something other than screens, right? So he's got a big sample. He can detect that thing out at the tail end of this distribution, but when he finds that negative correlation, it's not accounting for a lot, and it's just a correlation, right? It just means that they went into a school and kids reported they spent a certain amount of time online and they reported worse mental health, right? So we're not quite at the stage, I think, of panic with this, and in fact, I think in the middle range where the vast majority of kids are, we're not seeing the negative mental health effects, right? But there are other things. There's sleep, right? We see problems with that. So this is not to say that it's an entirely positive story, but what you're hearing in the media right now isn't really aligning with what we know about kids, what we know about this generation of kids, and what we know about how tech might affect them. Okay. So this was the response to the Apple investors. There's been a little bit of pushback from this letter. So Apple investors say iPhones cause teen depression, science doesn't, right? And so this is the author of that study. The data they're just not there, right? They're just not there to support this. All right, so what are the risks in having this broader conversation, about phones? What are the risks of parents taking away their kids' phones? What are the risks of assuming that phones, which has been the most recent thing, which has gotten pretty serious, where mobile phone use has been blamed for the uptick in suicides among young people and depression? So mental health among the entire generation of kids looks okay, but what we do see in some of the CDC data is for girls, for young adolescent girls, we see this uptick in cases of major depression, right? So there's a subpopulation where something is going on there, right? We're seeing an increase in some emergency room visits for girls in this age range. And there's been studies in a similar vein with explaining 1% or less percent of the variance, saying, oh, there's association that kids who are online a bit more might experience more forms of depression. But we've known for a really long time that when you're depressed, you do different things. You sit in front of your television, you're more passive, right? So it's just as likely going the other way. And so in May last year, I kind of wrote an op-ed that said, wait, this is serious. There is a problem with young women. We are seeing this uptick, and if we just accept that mobile phones are to blame and we start to take those away, there are some real risks. And one of those risks is missing the real causes of something that's harmful for kids. In no universe, in a medical setting, would we accept this level of evidence for things that are harming our kids in this way. We shouldn't for mental health, right? And so it was a kind of a call to let's figure out what's really happening with depression in general, and let's figure out what the role of phones may or may not be in a way that's more than just correlational. So I think that's where we're headed now. And I also don't think this entire conversation is positive about phones. So in our own work, for kids who are already at risk, we find negative associations, right? So for kids who are struggling and their offline lives with mental health problems, we've found some negative effects. And so I mentioned the My Life study, which is here in California. In this study, we brought the kids and the parents into the laboratory. We did had some conversations with kids and parents about a lot of things, including how parents monitored their kids' phone use. We followed them into the world for 30 days on their phones, 3 times a day, getting information on mental health and phone use and experiences. And then 18 months later, we followed them up. And in that study, and these were kids who were screened to be at risk, already having problems, so behavioral problems identified by teachers and by parents who were struggling in school. And for those kids, and these are the things that we measured, we do find this association when kids who are experiencing behavioral problems spend more time online that day. The same day, they're experiencing more problems with attention, right, and mental health problems. And then over time, those kids experience the worst increases in mental health, right? So these are kids who are, again, already struggling. For depression, we actually find the opposite, right? So we find on days where kids are sending more text messages, they actually report less symptoms of depression, right? They're happier, they're more connected to their social networks, right? So that's not too surprising, and it points to the ways that we know kids are using their phones, right? So Marion Underwood at Texas has done this wonderful work taking the actual text messages of kids, analyzing them to see what they're saying. It's not that, it's not that racy or exciting. In fact, it's pretty mundane. It's the types of things that kids talk about in daily life, right? So there's not a lot of negative talk. They're connecting in the same ways. And so we find this kind of positive association, and again, it's not small. It's small. It's not a huge effect. It's just there. It's that when kids are happier, or when kids spend more time online in a day, they report being a little bit happier. Now, this is a high-risk sample. Mikey Jensen is here from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and we've done a larger study with 2,000 kids, North Carolina representative of the population. 400 of those kids we followed intensively, again, with the same protocol, kind of 14 days, every day, getting information on their digital technology use and their mental health. No effects on mental health, right? No effects, nothing, right, on daily mental health. But we do find the same effect of, more text sent in a day, the less depressed they are, right? So we're just not seeing what the fear is about with depression and the kinds of technology that we've been focusing on, right? So I think this idea that kids are using technology to connect to friends, that there might be some positive benefits, is something that Stephanie Reich, who's here, knows well, and she did this incredible study that followed 251 high school students, 110 college students, and looked at the actual overlap. So who are kids connecting with online and offline? And they look pretty similar, right? So offline friends, and she can correct me in the question period, but offline friends and online friends look really similar in terms of who they are. And this recent review of 48 studies shows that kids are using online communication, right? They might be novel, the way that they're using. They might be using Snapshot where they didn't use it before, but many of the core features of friendships, of what we know about what makes a good friend, what helps kids become friends, what supports those relationships, those persist in these online interactions, and kids might be using digital technologies in ways to connect with friends that they would have previously done offline, right? So again, this theme of online and offline overlap. So again, Maddie has done some interesting work where she's thought of this idea of virtual communication and virtual support, right? And part of the reason we like our phones, and kids might like their phone, is the ability to reach you, right, for support, the ability to reach their friends for support, to elicit support. There's been some concern about helicopter parenting. Some of you might have just sent your kids away from college, so you might be especially interested in this study. And so Maddie did two things, right? And the first thing she did is she did an experiment where she brought first-year students who were just transitioning to college into the lab. They played this task which was called cyberball, and which results in often feeling kind of socially rejected, and showed in that study that virtual communication can actually help you bounce back from that, right? So you have this feel, you get a lowered self-esteem, but you're able to text your parent, so virtual communication, and that will help you to bounce back quicker after that rejection. She then followed students out into the world as they went through their college dorm rooms. She follows them with wearables and with mobile phones, so she had a lot of interesting information on the lives of college students. But you know, one of the things we've been interested in is how kids respond to daily stressors, right? So how kids might be reacting when they experience something, a slight, daily discrimination, bad grade, etc. And what she finds is on days that kids have contact with their parents, when they experience those stressors, we don't see the same kind of coupling with negative affect or with sleep, right? We don't see the same kind of effect of those events on kids' lives, right? So this virtual support by parents providing us some clues that could be supporting kids not only when they're home with you, walking around in the world and going to high school, but as they transition to college, right? So there could be some benefits here of the virtual communication. All right. So I think one of the important things to kind of takeaway points is, you know, most adolescents, if you look at those big national data sets, most adolescents are thriving in the digital age on markers that are really important and costly, right? Getting an education, right? Avoiding teen pregnancy, avoiding drugs, the kind of risky behaviors that we've deemed as high cost. Crime is down. I'm looking at the criminologists in the room, right, among kids. More data is needed, but the current panic around, you know, this generation of kids being lost or destroyed, I think is a wrong narrative to paint about our kids, right? It's just not supported by the data right now. So, you know, what are the things to think about as we go forward, and what are the things in the data that we see we need to think about to ensure that digital technologies can support all children? So one of the things that our group has been really focused on recently is thinking about this digital divide, right? And traditionally, we've thought about the digital divide in terms of who has access to technology, right? And we want everybody to have access. We want everyone to be able to get online, to do their homework and the rest of it. And you saw from that graph that access has started to become pretty universal, right? But what we see time and time in the data is that the experiences are a little bit different. If we take, for example, income, lower income kids are spending a little bit more time doing passive things on screens, right? They don't have, our European colleagues have shown us time and time again, they don't have the same kind of parental mediation in places to help them leverage technology in more positive ways. So higher income kids might be using technologies to assist their learning, to search for content, and we're finding children from lower income households are spending more time passively online or engaged in social media. We find in our North Carolina sample that children from lower income backgrounds are also reporting more negative online to offline experiences, right? So they're more likely to report that something on social media has caused them to get in a physical fight offline, has caused them to get in trouble at school, has caused them to, you know, experiencing some difficulty in relationships offline. So we need to be aware of those things. And again, offline risk is predicting online problems, and it might be the case that we have to think about a new digital divide that isn't about who has a phone and who has access, right? And lots of people are thinking about this, but equalizing the experience and the opportunities, right? So minimizing the risk for kids who we see that are vulnerable offline and are more likely to be vulnerable online, and ensuring that they have the same kind of opportunities that many of the kids in our higher income schools or higher income families are experiencing from living in the digital age, having parents that are guiding their technologies, that are individualizing their learning, right? And so really it's no longer about who has the phone, but how we can balance this equity. There's a movement now to see screen time a little bit differently, and this goes with the theme of the conversation about taking your kid's phone away or limiting the number of hours. You know, I think we've moved past that. The American Academy of Pediatrics would routinely put out statements that was, for children under 2 hours is enough, right? Well, that's not helpful, right? So they've now switched to more of a family media plan, right? Where you design with your family what's best for you, right? Everyone does have, parents have an N of 1, right, or N of 2. We follow kids intensively day to day to see how digital technology might influence sleep and behavior. With your kids who might be more sensitive, right, to spending more time online, right, and those are things that you can calibrate within your family without looking at the big data. We're kind of on this cusp of this digital revolution, and the question is no longer whether your kid's going to be on a phone or whether your kid's being engaged with technology, but how we can be engaged and smart about promoting that and ensuring that they minimize the risk and amplify the opportunity. I think there's a need for scientists. We often do our little studies and we publish in our little journals and no one really reads them. And we're in a new world, and I think we're seeing this with this recent panic, right? Where those who are going to speak out and convey information and convey the information potentially in the wrong way, we have to as a community stand up and translate the work and translate it in ways that make sense. This was an open letter that we signed in The Guardian, which was a group of scientists in the UK. Policymakers were pushing against bans for cell phones in certain contexts due to concerns about childhood obesity. And again, the research wasn't there, right? And again, if we assume phones are to blame for childhood obesity, which has been rising long before phones were an issue, we're going to miss the causes of childhood obesity. And that's the number 1 threat to life expectancy, right? So there are costs. Parents, okay. This is not an easy issue, and statisticians and science can dismiss some of the things, but you got to go home to your kid who's on their iPad and you don't like it, right? You want them off, and parents don't like it, and kids don't like you on their phone, and so that in itself is a problem, right? So the perception that there is a problem, the perception that phones are causing problems, can be a problem, right? And so what do you do? I would say the first thing you should do is buy this book, which is not my book, right? It's just Yalda Yule's at Common Sense Media, and she does this really beautiful job of laying out kind of what the facts are, what the fears are, and kind of what parents can do. She's a parent of adolescents. She was a Hollywood media executive, and she was a PhD in psychology. So Yalda is the first book that I read in thinking about how to parent in the digital age. And so I would say that she is an excellent resource. I think the other thing, if you take anything away from today, it's this idea of offline to online risk. And people often think of the phone as a cause. I've started to think of the phone as a mirror. And it's allowing us to see some of the things we couldn't see before, right? And that might be helpful in parenting. That might allow us to get there quicker, right? That might allow us some insight into our kids' relationships. It might allow us, kind of some early warning signs that we need to pay attention to. So the phone can be a mirror. We know a lot of good kind of media practices. It can be hard, I don't really want to play Minecraft all day, but if my kid wants, I'll do it. And so there are opportunities, to engage with your kids around this. They're excited. I'm looking at Charis because she cornered me in Starbucks, like my kid, right? It's anxiety provoking, but I've learned to kind of like some of those games. But there's opportunities to engage around things that your kids like. And the number 1 thing about that is you actually know what they're doing, and it eases some of your anxiety when you go there. To active parental mediation of technology use, to kind of talk about what they're seeing online. And so there's a lot of talk right now about apps that can help kids limit or monitor their use. And we know from years of research on parental monitoring and restricting your kids' behaviors is what we want to do, but it's not what works in the end. What works is having that strong relationship where they tell us, right? So we need to let them go out into the world, right? And we need to let them go out in the virtual world. And the best source of information about what's happening, what's bothering them, is going to be them, right? And then the last one is to model, right? And so kids don't like you on your phone. And parents report that they don't like themselves on their phones. So, there are good times to kind of put it away and engage in things that are going to improve the quality of life in the family. All right, so I'm going to end with this, and it's a quote from one of that was shared with Yalda. Yalda shared. It was from one of the focus groups, and it's, adults don't get it. They think I'm addicted to technology, but I'm not addicted to technology. I'm addicted to my friends, right? And that's where they're going. That's where they're connecting, and this is just the tool, the medium that it happens through. So with this, I'm getting the signal that we'll leave time for questions. I want to thank kind of our research team that's been involved in this for a very long time. A number of people that all should be added to this as well. But thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
I'm interested in the measures of mental health. I mean, how do you measure something like self-esteem? Is it a question that is answered or a set of questions? And if so, how can you ensure the people answering the question fully understand the options?
Yeah. So that's exactly the point. So the research I showed you on self-esteem, it's usually about a 6 to 10 item scale, and it's things like I feel good about myself, and I feel like I am competent to do certain amounts of things. So it's all kids self-report. Right? And that's how they're gauging from these large-scale studies to talk about kids' mental health. One of the things we wanted to do was track in daily life, kind of how are you feeling today, right? What experiences have you had today, and kind of improve that measurement a little bit, but we're still relying on kids to tell us. Yeah.
I think I'm a bit large enough. I'm just curious to see the youngest age, and I know for me as a parent with a 2-year-old who just, again, modeling behavior, and she hates it when I'm on the phone, but she loves to be on it too.
Yeah.
So that resonated with me, and I understand, a lot of it has to do with her growing, and I have to be paying attention to her, and that's what I'm really gathering from what you're saying is we need to pay attention to her behavior and seeing, do I need to limit it? Is it okay to have her a little bit more? But I guess I'm still feeling that danger, like how much I should and how much I shouldn't.
And I think we should feel that danger, and that means that we're in tune with a lot of the risks, and it's how we think about our kids' exposure to a lot of things, right? So we calibrate it, and the digital environment, it's a new environment, but it's not a new way of parenting, right? So offline and online parenting, it's the same kind of thing where you're calibrating my kid, how are they responding to setting, how much do I know about it, do I feel comfortable with it? And so in some ways for parents, these large-scale data sets, they're driving a narrative, but they don't speak to your N of 1, right? Your N of 1, right? Charles.
Thank you for letting me sleep better at night now after this talk. Oh, thank you. So really interesting work. Thank you so much. Quick question about gender. And because you explained that there were some differences between low-income youth and those sort of more middle class in terms of what they're doing and the impacts. What about gender? Are outcomes of mental health different for boys versus girls? Or any other distinctions in the data that are worth mentioning?
Yeah. So I think just in general with gender, we know that, for boys, conduct problems tend to be more of an issue, and for girls, depression onsets a little bit earlier, and we see more of it, right? And so those are just things that are happening. I think the big concerns around boys are with gaming, right? And where there's actually a new disorder, so it's gaming addiction, and this is very controversial, but it will provide some resources to kids who are on that extreme end. Most of the gaming research finds that really it can be a social experience. There's not a lot of negative effects, and actually there's some positive research around gaming for girls with spatial and visual ability early on. But again, you don't want to put your 6-year-old girl in front of a game for the entire day. But girls who are gaming now with more diverse sets of games that have a more social component, the research is actually suggesting there's some interesting kind of positive effects on spatial abilities. And games are being used in therapies with kids, right? And so we think about virtual reality, conditioning, CBT, so kind of conditioning fear response out, and we're able to immerse kids in settings to extinguish some fears. And so there's some creative ways that gaming can do that.
Is my mic? Yeah. I just kind of building on the addiction concept. I have a question about that because I know, I'm addicted to my phone. If I can't find it, I go into a panic, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. It's interesting that you say I'm not addicted to my friends. I'm addicted to information. I'm addicted to access to email. But is addiction to friends maybe a good thing? Or have people studied the addictive nature of this? Because it is addictive.
Yeah. So I'm kind of smiling because I'm looking at Simone, who we met. She's in computer science here at UCI, a PhD student, and she's working on this exact thing in terms of thinking about kind of addiction narratives that we have, that parents have. Let me see if I actually have this slide, Simone. Yeah, there they are. So, right, right. That was a good plan. But so there is, when you look even in our data about fears, kids are responding, and kids believe that phones are causing all these kinds of problems, right? And they're addicted and they can't get off of them, right? So that's an issue in and of itself, like our beliefs and we're worried about it. But when we look at actual impairments, right? So impairments offline, that's where we're not seeing the high correlation until we get out to the extreme end. So it might be a narrative that we're kind of telling ourselves and that people are buying into. But in terms of real effects, how we would think about it, mental health, is it impairing your work? Is it impairing your relationships? Is it impairing, some other aspects of life? That's where the data just isn't there. But.
What about sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sleep, and Maddie and I wrote about this in the review paper. Get the phones out of the bedroom, right? And this is a place where there is really good experimental work, right, where we present the information on paper, on a tablet, and you find in really good experimental work in sleep lab studies that it interrupts circadian rhythm, that we're getting, the kids are getting less sleep. And that's just the blue light, right, from the screen, not to mention all the affective arousal that comes with being online and being concerned. So you've probably heard a lot of things about kids who sleep with the phone under their pillow, not to miss this, kids texting patterns, we see it ramp up at night. So this is an area where, you should talk to your kids about the effects this is having on sleep, get the phones out of the bedroom for various reasons. People say, but it's my alarm clock, right? Yeah. There's this thing called an alarm clock, right? But yeah, sleep, that's one of the areas where the science is good, it's clear.
Hi. So there's a new initiative called Wait Until 8th. I don't know if you've heard about it. It was founded by a mom in Austin, Texas, who has young children, and she was concerned about what she was seeing in older children. And she started this online pledge. So the idea is now a lot of parents don't necessarily want to get their children phones, but they feel the social pressure. So she wants to try to flip that in the other direction, or at least establish a critical mass. So if your child asks you for a phone, you can say, well, actually, these 10 other kids in your class also aren't getting phones until at least 8th grade.
Right.
So I'm just curious what you think about that, given your research.
So the theory behind it, in Iceland, they actually mandate by age a curfew, which takes this pressure off parents. If you're 10, everyone's home at 9:30. And that's nice because it takes the conflict out, right? And those kind of movements, I think, can be really effective if you get a critical mass of people and there's not the peer pressure. I don't think these trend lines tell us that will be effective, right, as a strategy. So there's two things. Will that be effective in kind of curbing the proliferation of phones? Maybe for a small group of concerned parents, but probably not in general. And then the second part of that question is that a good idea to wait to 8, right? And, I don't know, right? So one, we don't know. These cohorts of children, each one that comes through is kind of a new cohort. They haven't had this kind of exposure. But what I do know is that the world is going to demand certain skills and certain competencies in terms of dealing with this, right, and dealing with the online world. And some of that is going to start early. It doesn't mean we sit our kids in front of an iPad from like 2 to 8, but I think it does mean that we scaffold it in the ways that we would scaffold other things. And so drawing a bright line for an age that doesn't take into account the kid, the parent's need, if the parent needs to get in touch with them, doesn't seem like a great strategy. Yeah. But it's kind of to keep them off social media. Yeah, I think the other thing is with kids, anything we restrict, they will do. And so I would kind of come back to the point about clear communication, a strong relationship, and once you have those communication around technology, then there are safe ways to introduce this, right?
One question here. What about the harmful effects of phones? Like the waves and electronics and like stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of conversation about that. This is another place that there's really not great evidence, including from really large studies, that the actual way. So we're talking about the California public policy or public health release. Yeah.
Like, I sleep next to my phone sometimes.
Right. So those studies are done on rats, right? So the evidence from so you should not sleep by your phone for the other reasons, right? Because it'll interfere with your sleep because you're worried about responding to the phone. Right. 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 So I think the epidemiologists would say we haven't seen evidence, given the rapid uptick in exposure, of the kinds of problems that we'd expect to see if that were the case. I think there is some animal research that with very high exposure in a tiny cage with a rat, that there are some harmful effects, but those effects have been extrapolated to humans in ways that probably don't generalize. And so I'm not an expert in this area, but I would, again, just take some themes from this talk of take those findings with a grain of salt. Yeah.
Thanks for a great presentation. I think your work's really important, providing an evidence base to counter this sort of declining mental health cliff narrative.
Yeah.
One of the things I wonder, beyond the mental health measures per se, are some of the trade-offs that come with multimedia multitasking, in terms of fragmented attention, perhaps less time for contemplation and sort of deep reflection if you're switching from one thing to another on a screen. Our reliance on GPS navigation, which may be changing our cognitive mapping capacities or capabilities. So I think, moving beyond the mental health criteria per se, there may be these other trade-offs going on with the digital age. And I agree with you, we're not going back. I mean, this is a kind of revolution that's here to stay. But societally, it may be important to reckon with, what some of those trade-offs might be as we move further into the digital age.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think what we're going to see is these pendulums of pushback. People will go completely offline to green, right, to green space and time outdoors, and then we're going to see various pushes. But I think in general that trend, stock, is going to keep going up in terms of more and more reliance on these kinds of technologies. So, my colleagues in computer science would say that we're uncertain of what the digital future looks like, and that kind of wiring or infrastructure might be more adaptive in that environment. I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, but I think that's kind of the positive argument. And I think that one of the things that's interesting is you get pulled in this area into kind of the positive and the negative side. You're either pro-technology, right, or you're anti-technology. So I feel this pressure to kind of defend it at this point, but what I'm really saying is we have to balance it in any situation, and with every kid, it's going to just be a little bit different. And I think the really good news is that this isn't an entirely, for parents, this isn't an entirely new space or set of risks, right? We've got some of this, we know some of this, and we shouldn't feel that we don't have the capacity or the skills to navigate it.
I've got a loud voice, so it can get even louder. One thing that I'm interested in right now is this concept of ecotherapy, right? And it's almost the antithesis of this.
Yeah.
But I didn't see any mention or hear anything from a relative perspective. There's a lot of research on the number of hours spent on the phone, and I'm curious if people are talking about the element of how many hours in nature specifically, or in an environment that's non-technical, to see how those either counterbalance or interact.
Yeah, so we should talk. So I have a student who's studying green space from satellite imagery to try and understand people's, because this is the same belief that the time in these spaces might have restorative or might have kind of helpful benefits. And this is the displacement hypothesis, that if kids weren't on their phones, they would be outside playing. I don't know that we have a lot of support for that. I don't know if that's the thing, if that's a counterfactual or the thing they would be doing otherwise. I think we'd like to think, and that's part of the narrative, that if they weren't on their phone, they'd be out playing soccer. But I don't think that that's the trade-off. I think there's definitely a cut, and we've seen this decline in time spent outdoors, of kids' free playtime, but we've seen that prior to the phone. And a lot of these trends that we're seeing in the data that are being attributed to the phone, that's been a trend that's been happening for a number of years, right? So I think just caution in terms of the same thing in the UK, and that was what was driving that public health intervention, was this idea of obesity and outside time. If we target the phone and kind of congratulate ourselves that we've cut off the phone and kids will be outside, I don't think that switch is going to happen as easily.
Okay, well, please, a huge round of applause for wonderful presentation. And now you can all get back on your phones.
Exactly. It was stressful to be off.